crazy things that people do, or I'll rephrase it another way, it's always worth looking back on 20 years and asking yourself the question, what have direct marketing people fundamentally been right about, and what have they been wrong about? And the pleasing verdict on that, I'd say, is that actually direct marketing people were instinctively right about quite a lot. The best bit of advice possibly, which was absolutely classic direct marketing advice when I first started in 1988, was that great line, start with a coupon. So one of the most important lessons, I think, for all marketers from direct marketing is start with the behaviour you want. And actually, you should start by having a pretty serious debate about what the behaviour is you want and how you describe it and what choices you give people. And one of the interesting findings from recent experimentation in the behavioural sciences is that, for example, people don't choose in absolute terms. They don't have absolute preference or any idea of what the cost-value equation of something is. They choose comparatively. So maybe the first question you should always ask when you design that coupon is, are we asking people to do one thing, or are we asking them to make a choice between two different things? Secondly, the oldest lesson of the lot, if they decide not to do anything, do we just let them throw the letter in the bin, or do we ask them and cleverly contrive so that they have to write back and say no? Now that is actually the simplest idea, what you might call the Reader's Digest yes-no box, which is contrive a message so that you need a reply from these people with a decision. Most direct marketing makes the fundamental mistake that it has an implicit default. Now, there's an excuse, obviously, if you're writing to people who aren't your existing customers, in that you can't really ask complete strangers to write back and say, no, I don't want an American Express card, I accept that. When you're writing to existing customers, one of the most successful things you can do is simply to reframe the choice or re-portray the choice in terms of, we need to know from you whether you'd like to upgrade to a suite or stay with a room. And I think that's possibly the most overlooked thing of the lot. Reader's Digest knew it for years. Through the prize draw, they contrived a reason for you to send back the envelope, even if you didn't want a subscription to Reader's Digest. I've never noticed bigger sales effects from any, what you might call, trivial change, than simply saying, if you're writing to an existing customer, every now and then, you can't do it all the time, but actually ask them, which of these three things would you like? Write and let us know, rather than the usual default choice architecture, which is, if you want to buy this thing, go to all the trouble of, getting a pen, ticking a box, putting in an envelope, and going to the post box. And if you don't want this thing, just chuck the letter in the bin. So getting a response, any response, even if it's no, is probably a good thing in itself, but it also massively increases the number of yeses you get, simply because you have a much more symmetrical question. So that's now called choice architecture. We didn't actually call it choice architecture 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I'm sure Reader's Digest didn't call it choice architecture. But it's one of the biggest things that actually affects human decision making. The second mistake I think people make is they assume that preference is constant, which is one of the assumptions that most accountants make and most economists make, which is that actually whether you want something or not is effectively constant in your head. Very simple lesson, if you send people an identical mailing to the identical list 2 weeks after you sent the first mailing out, you'll get about 50% of the response you got first time round. Why is that? People are just in a different mood. Their situations have changed, but just as likely, their moods changed. Something's just changed. The idea that, that if you've written to somebody once, they don't want it 4 weeks later is a really dangerous assumption. What we're increasingly starting to discover about human behaviour is that actually it's hugely contextual. It depends on the mood you're in, it depends on who it comes from. There are extraordinarily important little things. Now, what's important about all this stuff, by the way, I'm talking about, how do you design the coupon with the boxes? Do you write to the same people shortly afterwards? Do you do a follow-up letter, for example? All these things tend to be forgotten about because they're kind of trivial. And so that's the other terrible mistake, I think. I've seen this so many times in direct marketing, which is all the effort and debate goes into what's salient, visible, and expensive, rather than what's important. And that's the assumption that what's expensive is important. And we have this very dangerous, I think, idea that actually the scale of the effect in marketing is kind of proportional to the scale and expense of the intervention. Some of the biggest effects I've ever seen in marketing have been tweaking tiny little details. Really small things, experimenting in particular in really small areas, where you suddenly realise that redesigning the application form has a bigger effect than changing the central proposition of the letter. And we don't spend enough of our time there. Likewise, we don't spend enough of our time testing offers. Now, what does an offer mean? It could mean a free offer, a reward, or something like that. Actually, it can simply mean how you frame the price, how you design price, whether you offer 3 things at 3 varying prices or just one thing at one fixed price. That kind of thing gets far too little attention, particularly when you think about it. What we tend to assume, which is an incredibly dangerous assumption, is that the central foundation assumption of classical economics, which is that if you drop the price of something, demand goes up and people are happier buying it. That is extraordinarily dangerous as an assumption. It's probably true more often than it's not. Quite often the reverse is true. Nobody wants to stay on in a £45 a night hotel on their honeymoon. There are quite a lot of cases in the art world. People often say, if you've had a painting in the window for £2,000 and it hasn't sold, double the price. There are quite a lot of areas where actually increasing the price can sell more. Now that is an extraordinarily valuable discovery because you get a kind of double whammy effect, obviously. Equally, the assumption that by dropping the price you'll sell more is an incredibly dangerous assumption because you might actually be losing money while thinking you're doing the right thing. What will then happen is you'll attribute your failure to completely the wrong things. Very frequently what will happen is that sales will fall. I'll give you a perfect example. In testing in mail order catalogues, typically an identical dress sent to an effectively identical list, you will sell more of the dresses at £29 than you will at £34, but you also sell more of the dresses at £39 than you do at £34. That's a pretty important discovery, I'd argue. So the stuff around the transaction, because it's just in the coupon, as it were, and that is, of course, the least self-aggrandizing job in all of direct marketing, is designing the coupon, designing the form. No one gets promoted for a great coupon. Everybody wants to be seen, debating what the headline is, what's the central proposition, let's discuss, this photographic shoot and spend hours and hours and hours agonizing about the photography. But tiny details around the design of the transaction can have absolutely massive effects. And yet most of the most intelligent people, or the most experienced people, and most of their time is actually directed elsewhere to what is more visible, but what isn't necessarily more important. Testing in price alone is probably the most important form of testing, but we don't do it very much. Testing mechanisms for how you charge for things. Amazon Prime I always think of as being the most beautiful and simple loyalty program in the world. If you shop quite a lot at Amazon, you pay £38 a year and you get all your next day deliveries for free. In behavioural terms, it's a commitment device. It's effectively a sort of exchange where you give Amazon an awful lot more of your share of wallet in exchange for preferential treatment. But you value it, interestingly, because you pay for it. Now, that kind of exchange is so important in Amazon's case that one of the things that Wall Street uses to judge the Amazon share price is the number of customers who are signing up for Amazon Prime, number one, and in particular the age groups they come from. It's particularly popular with younger people who are effectively happy just to move a large chunk of their retail spend from offline onto online. But what interests me is, here's another lesson. Nobody steals enough. Okay? Amazon Prime is an idea which you can apply and test for any number of different product categories, and yet very few people do. There's only 2 instances I can think of where someone's copied Amazon Prime. One of them I think is EasyJet has a thing called EasyJet Plus, where you pay quite a lot, but then you get free checked-in luggage and other stuff. I think Ryanair does something similar, and Ocado does a thing called the Ocado Delivery Pass, where you pay £100 a year, but all your deliveries are free. A third assumption that's dangerous. If you want people to do something for you, maybe just a small favour that's valuable, you don't necessarily have to pay them money. Again, this is the poisoning of human relations by the assumption that everything is governed by economic law and economic incentive. Possibly one of the most important and beautiful ideas in all direct marketing, and I'd argue in all behavioural economics, in the last 5 to 10 years, is the Ocado Green Van. Now, the Ocado Green Van, when you get to choose your delivery on Ocado, I booked an Ocado delivery last night at 2 o'clock in the morning, really, because that's the sort of nutbag I am. But you're presented with a whole series of times. Now, some of us are really particular about when the delivery arrives. It has to be between 9 and 10 in the morning because I'm taking the children to school or I have to get to work or whatever. But half the people, we don't care. You know, actually I'm going to be in all day watching Trisha. I'm not really that bothered when the bloody van turns up. Now, every economist would have said to Ocado, you have to use the price mechanism to encourage people to choose deliveries at economically more valuable times when you're already making a delivery in the area, and therefore where you can therefore make more deliveries within a time slot, and of course the distance travelled by your vans is reduced. You must use an economic mechanism where you incentivise people to choose deliveries at more economic times. And Ocado brilliantly didn't do that. They just said, we'll just make some of the vans green. And we'll just say, if you choose a green van, it kind of helps the environment and means we don't have to drive around so far. It's just a bit zen, to be honest. What I don't know is the exact figures, because they won't say. What I do know is that Ocado were utterly astounded at the success of what is basically a nudge. It's an encouragement to useful behaviour with no particular economic incentive attached, and you choose the green van because it makes you feel a bit good. It's basically what I like to call bubble wraponomics, which should be a whole field in the social sciences. Why do we pop bubble wrap? Okay? It doesn't make the bubble wrap more useful, it actually makes it completely useless because it loses all its bubbliness of it. We just do it because it feels good. Study into what feels good. First of all, there are a couple of other interesting things about the green van. It works astoundingly well, because nearly everybody who's indifferent will go, well, I mean, I don't really care, you know, whether it's delivered at 9 o'clock or 2:30 in the afternoon, and if one of those vans is green, well, it's good enough for me. It's an astonishingly effective thing, which, had economists been involved in it, would have cost Ocado, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions every year in reduced delivery charges. They just made one of the vans green. Now, interestingly, steel, for God's sake. Airlines, when I fly to New York, I'm not one of those thrusting account man wankers who goes, well, I'll go and put in a full day at the office and then I'll go to Heathrow and catch the late flight out. My view is I put in my diary, Thursday, going to New York. Okay? Very simple. In the 19th century, it took 5 days. Now it takes 1. That's good enough. Okay, that's fast enough. I'm not going to try and do it, in the evening. And anyway, the company's making me go to New York. Why should I do it in my own time? So, I'm not that bothered whether I fly at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or whether I fly at 9 o'clock in the morning. So, 9 o'clock's a bit early, frankly, because I'd like to have a lie-in. But what's typically used by yield management is price reduction. Now, if you're travelling on business and someone else is paying for your ticket, that doesn't work that well anyway. You know, I love WPP shareholders to bits, but not that much. Okay? Why doesn't somebody simply say, either this is the green choice, just say, this flight tends to be underbooked, so the more people who go on it, the better, because it's just greener? Or, actually, why not just say, this flight is the least crowded? Because that's pretty good. I'll always go on the flight that's less crowded. It's quicker getting through customs. If you're going in economy, you might get an empty seat next to you, even 2 empty seats, so you can lie down, which is apparently known as a Croydon upgrade. If you're in business, it's just nice to be on a slightly emptier plane. When the plane's completely full, it's a bit stressful. No one is actually doing those little bits of information sharing. You can get millions of pounds of value from people just by tweaking little bits of information like that. Now, there's a psychological effect which applies here as well. I'm sitting in the RSA, which is about 100 yards from Benjamin Franklin's house, where he lived in London for about 10 years. It's the only surviving house where Benjamin Franklin lived. And Benji, who invented direct marketing, interestingly, according to one report, where he actually owned a bookshop and started writing to past customers of the bookshop with recommendations about future books they might like to order, and then offered to deliver them. So he effectively sort of invented intelligent mail order. Benjamin had this theory that actually if you want people to like you, don't always rely on reciprocation. Actually, strangely, ask them to do a favour for you. Because nearly everything works in reverse. Now, you're going to ask what I mean by that. Actually, yes, it's true that we do favours for people we like, but we also like people we do favours for. There's a famous example of Benjamin Franklin who wanted to win the support of a political rival, effectively. Now, what most people would have done is invite him out to dinner and plied him with fine foods and Belgian chocolates. Benjamin didn't do this because he was too astute a psychologist. He knew that this man owned a very rare book in his library, and he wrote a beautiful letter asking to borrow it. And the man duly lent Benjamin the book. Benjamin read it, and then sent it back, or actually returned it by hand, with a very beautiful note of thanks. What's interesting about that is we like people we do favours for. Shortly afterwards, this chap was willing to give Benjamin Franklin support in some important vote. That's another technique, interestingly, which we maybe don't deploy nearly enough. Just ask people to do very small things for us. I've never had a text from British Airways saying, actually, no problem if it's difficult, but if you could do us a favour by flying out to New York at 11:30 rather than 10:15, it would be really helpful. Okay? Just try it, just ask. Because strangely, we like interactions like that, even if in classical economic terms we're actually, in a sense, the person doing the favour. We just like trading favours and exchanging little transactions of that kind, because that's what all human civilization is based on. So that's another small thing. Actually, ask people very nicely to do things for you without necessarily bribing them. I would argue that the request from British Airways would actually be less potent emotionally if it came attached with 5,000 free air miles. They could offer that subsequently as a thank you. But if it was turned into a transaction of the if you do this, I will do that, then a lot of those transactions lose their meaning. It's a bit like, generally, it's very nice to buy flowers for the opposite sex. It's not a good idea to say, now I've bought you these flowers, will you sleep with me? That's a different kind of transaction. Sometimes you have to actually separate the generosity in an exchange. You have to actually make it seem as non-commercial as possible. So actually, just ask, be nice. That's a very simple technique which direct marketers never use, again, because we're enthralled to sort of economic logic. But actually our brains don't predominantly work that way. Other things, we've probably, let's be candid, direct marketing has made one big mistake. We've been right about the fact that actually behaviour matters. First of all, always write your brief in behavioural terms. And that's where direct marketers have been right. When you write a brief, do not say, I want people to think this, feel this, etc. Say, I want them to do this thing. There are a few reasons for that. One, if your communication results in a behaviour, you can measure it properly, particularly in the digital age, so you can tell whether you're succeeding or not. Secondly, you can probably work out the economic contribution of that new behaviour, when it's very difficult to work out an economic contribution of a different attitude or a different level of awareness. Thirdly, when you define your objective in behavioural terms, it's media neutral. Okay? If you define, as most advertising briefs are still written, if you write a brief about, I want people to think and feel this, the danger is you'll always end up using television simply because if you just want to change what people say, television, you change what people think, television is assumed to be the way you do it. Quite often, by the way, things work backwards in any case, that the behaviour actually precedes the attitude. There's a widespread belief that attitudinal change is necessary and sufficient to behavioural change. There's quite a lot of evidence that suggests that in many cases this simply isn't true. You can know as much as anybody about a field and it won't necessarily change your behaviour. One great finding which showed this beautifully is that French doctors are no less likely to smoke than an average Frenchman. They may know all the statistics about health outcomes, mortality, they probably spend a bit of time in a cancer ward, but they're still no less likely to smoke. Now, I did explain this partly by saying that if you are a smoking French doctor, you are, of course, the sexiest man in the world. So there are probably compensations. I imagine you can just walk into any kind of New York bar and go, I'm a doctor. And yeah, pretty much, it's a dead cert, isn't it? But, nonetheless, it's interesting that what people know doesn't affect what they actually do. Tell stories. One of the interesting things that most marketing has lost is the art of long copy. But a really damn good story is about the most potent thing that actually locks itself into the human brain and frames how we look at things. The dearth of long copy is really nothing to do with what was found to be effective or ineffective. It was all to do with, well, two things really. One, a completely mistaken belief about how advertising worked, which is that it was all about incredibly condensed communication. The second thing was that nobody could write it anymore, and so they found a good excuse not to have to do whatever they're bad at, which is a common human bias. This one thing that drives me nuts is, this isn't, by the way, entirely the agency's fault. We have tried to sell long copy approaches to clients, and they increasingly look at us as if we're mad. The whole way in which ads are researched doesn't help, because they're researched as headlines with graded text. That's a terrible bloody mistake. As Jeremy Bullmore puts it, sometimes you just need an argument. Sometimes you need to know 3 things before you make a decision, rather than 1. But most importantly, actually, before you actually put your name in the tick box or sign up to anything, in the moments leading up to that decision, fear is a more potent force than desire. So if nothing else, the long copy may be there simply to assuage, to banish possible objections, banish possible misunderstandings, or just to assuage fear and anxiety. But the fact that we don't test different formats for things strikes me as inherently dangerous. Incidentally, there are cases, by the way, where we make the opposite mistake. If you have had a long copy control, test a really short copy solution. Don't assume that because 3 pages, traditionally work really well, that you should make the next test 4. There's a corresponding, as I said, everything has an opposite. It's a really useful thing. Reciprocation is a very powerful force in human behaviour. We're nice to people who are nice to us, but equally it works backwards. When we're nice to people, we like them. There are all manner of these sort of reverse psychology things going on. One of the most interesting, the thing we should always make a note of in direct marketing is when you get one of those breakthrough effects where response doubles or is just monumentally high. And we should look at those cases and learn from them and learn from them and learn from them and actually seek them out. One of the most interesting cases I had was a product for, I think it was American Express, back in the 1990s, the early 90s. And it was a product where every time you booked a scheduled flight on the American Express card, you paid an extra £3 on your bill, and as a result you got an enhanced level of travel accident insurance. So if the plane crashed, or I can't remember, it extended to luggage, it certainly extended to hijack, and immolation. So it went as far as that anyway. And everything was failing. There was no way. And actually 2 of us just said, hold on a second, this is a 2-page letter, right? This is a 2-page letter trying to replicate what a travel agent would do as, oh, by the way, it's just an extra £3, but you do get £100,000 worth of insurance in the event something happens. So suddenly, the copy now is making this a big deal, and the decision isn't a big deal. So the other mistake we make in direct marketing is don't try and oversell things which actually are a gentle sell. Because the vast reams of copy in that instance aren't reassuring, they're anxiety-making. Because they go, there's obviously something lurking in here which I can't be bothered to uncover. So what we tried is, what had failed and failed and failed, we just said, make it a single, here's the solution, make it a single paragraph or 2, just say, by the way, one option we offer you people is X, if you'd like this, tick and let us know. It'll cost every time when a flight costs, 1,000 quid, 500 quid. Who notices £3 popped on the top of that? It's not a big deal. You could even better, you could say, we noticed you're married, so obviously travel insurance is a bit more important to you than other people. That's another thing. I'll come to this in a second. That simple flash of this is for me because is a brilliant, what you might call inoculation against rejection. That simple, I am writing to you because, is a magical thing to do. Now, the more obliquely you can do it, the better. Arguably, it comes to seem a bit cynical if it's done, too nakedly and too overtly. But if you can obliquely say, this is why we're writing to you, implicit and not other people, scarcity value and what you might call saliency go up enormously. I still wish I'd done this. BT launched a product which was a cordless phone that had particularly good range. Whereas most cordless phones, they basically started hissing and cracking. This is in the pre-DECT age, I think. They started hissing, farting and crackling as soon as you went through into the next room or went upstairs. This was a thing where basically you could be half a mile away from home. The phone would work. Bear in mind, this was the pre-mobile age as well, so particularly useful. So what I wanted to do, and I could never get people to do this, everybody wanted to do this immensely complicated segmentation model. I said, this is bullshit. This is a phone for people with big gardens and big houses, okay? Write to them and say, we noticed you've got a bit of a fuck-off garden that way. Have we got a phone for you? Now, obviously not in those terms. But, here's an interesting thing. As a creative person's view on targeting, right? We get obsessed with this idea of bloody models. And it's a segmentation model which involves a regression analysis across 13 different variables, right? Now, the only problem with that is it's creatively useless. When you segment simply in a binary segmentation, or even, if you like, a fourfold one, okay, I can write creative to all four. Because I can go, this bloke supports Arsenal. I know that for sure. End of story. Right, we've got a conversational gambit here. Probably wouldn't choose Arsenal fans, but this guy has a big garden. I know how to sell a guy with a big garden a fancy phone that has a big range. By the way, the use of this technique is most prevalent in the mobile phone industry, where whatever brand efforts are made by any of the mobile phone networks, any guy working in a mobile phone shop knows he can sell you onto whatever network he likes. Because people will come in and go, I quite like an Orange phone, Orange, pretty cool brand, yeah, I heard a lot about Orange. And he'd go, yeah, absolutely great, they're Orange, aren't they? They're great, aren't they? Fantastic, really good. Where do you live? I live in Chorlton-cum-Hardy. Ooh, you don't want an Orange phone there. Okay? The second, the power to use context to actually change people's behaviour, context and relevance can't be overstated. But one of my grumbles as a creative person about segmentation is it's fusing 12 variables. Now, I can't write to someone and say, I notice you come into segment 17B on our regression analysis, so you'll be really interested in this phone. Secondly, read a guy called Gerd Gigerenzer, who actually believes that take the best is, in many real-world situations, the best one to use. Simply say, which single variant most determines people's propensity, and we'll just focus on that one, rather than trying to build a model that actually incorporates more and more variables. And he's done various mail-order experiments that show this. And what annoys me is that actually, I'll give you an example actually, I wish I'd been able to do this. Two things that were interesting. American Express on TGI, the single thing that most predicts your likelihood to get an American Express card on TGI is your propensity to book travel individually, not as a package. So it's your propensity to go and hire a car, book a hotel, go to EasyJet and book flights, rather than going on a package holiday. Now, you might say, actually, we ought to build a whole business around this. You could say that there's a huge amount of NPD we can do here. But if instead of using segmentation, we just looked at this single variable and said that is an incredibly strong predictor of American Expressness, let's just go with that one. Equally, the other one I always said is, look, the target audience, this is, the target audience for American Express 10 years ago, roughly, they're dating now, is everybody with a laptop. Let's just say we want everybody with a laptop. This wouldn't apply now when laptops are more ubiquitous. But if we just sat down 10 years ago and said, okay, we want everybody with a laptop to have an AmEx card, what could you have done with that single thing? You know, you could have said, okay, free Wi-Fi for American Express card members. There are a bunch of people with, you know, frequent travellers who, frankly, the £37.50 a year would be justified by that alone. You know. But again, I'm starting to become increasingly sceptical about the misuse of big data, because actually the very thing that direct marketing can do, which is build a one-to-one relationship based on some piece of personal knowledge or situational relevance, is actually being destroyed once you amalgamate all this stuff and make it incomprehensible. Now, you can understand why the people who do the regression analysis like this, because it's like IT within a company. If you can create a sphere of your company which is incomprehensible to everybody else, you enjoy spectacular power and unbelievable lack of career fragility. Because you can basically just say, no, I'm very sorry, you can't fire me, Dave, because unfortunately it'll mean that, you know, the anti-doggle will fall out of the USB slot. They go, all right, okay, you're safe for life, mate, you know. If you can actually, you know, spread that particular... So read this book by Gigerenzer, Simple Heuristics That Make Us Smart, and ask yourself the question, are we actually overcomplicating this stuff? What we actually need is singular data points which are really interesting, which everybody can use. Not some totally weird segmentation analysis, which may actually be, frankly, pretty meaningless anyway, and may actually have a dangerous sort of noise-to-signal ratio. Because an awful lot of data is basically just, you know, crappy noise. So, what I've just talked about is a few things that always bother me. One, direct marketing was right about a lot of things, but our own sense of self-aggrandizement, now we've become digital, may cause us to forget, start with a coupon. What choice do we want people to make? Second thing, always look at context. Now, one of the weirdest, here's one of the weirdest things I genuinely don't understand. I've said this to our hotel clients, I don't mind giving it away to everybody. Anyway, to be honest, it works for every client, so it doesn't matter, I'm not giving away anything controversial. Quite often, I check in at a hotel at 10 o'clock at night, and I'm going to be leaving at 10 o'clock the following morning, okay? Now, it's pretty obvious when I'm checking in that it's fairly unlikely an Arab sheikh is going to turn up and go, I want the bridal suite for tonight, you know, on spec. Nobody's ever said to me, oh, by the way, if you do want a suite, we can have you, normally it'd be £200 million, but we can let you have it for another 40 quid. No one would tell. Now, why that's so important is that my booking for the hotel is now mentally a sunk cost. I've written that off already. So I'm now saying, not, God, it's 250 quid if I have a suite, or 190. I'm saying, well, it's only 40 quid and I get a suite. My whole mental frame of comparison has changed, and therefore my perception of value has changed. But also, you've lost nothing, because it doesn't cost, I mean, you know, the only possible risk is, of course, having a suite. I then decide to get loads of sort of, you know, hold some sort of wild party in which the place is trash. But the cost of cleaning a suite is basically no greater than the cost of cleaning a room. You made yourself a bit of extra money, and actually a little bit of extra warmth from me, and actually you've also set my bar a bit higher, so the next time I stay in your hotel, I might actually want to stay in a suite, because after that the room will just feel a bit crap. But, again, there's something peculiar that, you know, these things just don't get done. Now, actually, it suddenly occurred to me the other day. This is, by the way, it's totally my fault. I feel really apologetic. We've never written to people, as far as I know, who've applied for and been approved for the green card and said, actually, we just noticed you're also perfectly okay to get a gold card. We've never tried. Is this fair? I never remember us doing this.
Not confirming, not
saying you're already approved for the gold green card. What's great news is
you could also
have. As far as I know, we've never done this.
No.
Now what? Again, it's not interesting.
The obvious is always overlooked.
The obvious. That's problem. And also, you know, it's kind of, when a brief is written, it tends to be written with the moment preordained. We are writing to these people. So one of the great lessons of direct marketing, which digital has learned, I think, to a great effect, is you don't have a target audience in many cases, you have a target moment. And we spend a huge amount of our time looking for the target audience, but not the target moment. I think, Drayton, I remember you wrote a letter years ago to, I think, the World Wildlife Fund, which simply said there are all these safari lodges all over Africa, but they don't attempt to put me in contact with the WWF. Now, you know, the likelihood that you might actually show an interest in the WWF is probably 100 times greater at a safari lodge or similar than it is when you're sitting at home waiting for Downton Abbey to start. Okay? And the target moment thing is unbelievably huge. I mean, it's just enormous. Dummy choices, that's another thing. You know, should you create premium versions of things? I've suggested to BP jokingly, if you want to sell more BP Ultimate, create a third fuel called BP Super Ultimate Blingtastic Plus that costs £15 a litre. And people go, ooh, that's a bit expensive, I'll just have the ordinary Ultimate. Okay? Now, Steve Jobs, by the way, was a huge advocate of the rule of three. And what you'll notice is that all those products come out in three kinds. There's I think it's the 16 gig iPad, the 32 gig iPad, and the 64 gig iPad. First of all, when you have three things, it's good price discrimination, because rich people always buy the top of the range one, and there are also some people who can only just afford it. So it's brilliant price discrimination. It also makes choice easy because they're free. Broadly speaking, the way it works is if I am loaded, or I'm an Apple fanboy, or I'm buying a present for someone, really important, you buy the top of the range one. If basically you just want an iPad but you're not loaded or a huge, or a nut bag, you buy the middle one. And if you're cash constrained, you buy the cheap one. And that threefold pattern, it's broadly what you might call sort of Waitrose, Tesco, Lidl pattern. Seems to be very convenient. Interestingly, if you have 5 choices, people are often very much drawn towards not 3 but 2 or 4. And in the city, when they have 5 different investment options for a client, in order of risk, from 1 being the most risky to 5 being the safest, they always price 2 and 4 so they're more profitable than 1, 3 and 5. Because no client wants to choose 1 and 5 because 1 makes you look like a risk-taking lunatic, and 5 makes you look like your dad because you're so safe, and nobody wants to choose 3 because it looks like you're sitting on the fence, so everybody wants to choose 2 or 4. But understanding these patterns of choice is hugely useful in itself. But that's the vital thing is actually, I think, if I'm going to include one, if there's one useful thing I do in direct marketing still, and which I still do if I see a creative brief or if I see creative work, I think there's one final thing you can sum it up with. Drayton Bird said we always overlook the obvious. And here we actually have the perfect example of what I call the most important insights you can have, or what I call silver blaze insights from the Sherlock Holmes short story, the adventure or the mystery of the silver blaze. The silver blaze is the short story which gives us the phrase in English, the dog that didn't bark in the night. And what happens is that Lestrade is completely stumped by the disappearance of this racehorse, and he says to Holmes, can you possibly give me any help? And he said, Holmes replied, I'd like to point you to the curious incident of the dog in the night time. And Lestrade from Scotland replies, but the dog did nothing in the night time. To which Sherlock Holmes replies, that was the curious incident. The curious event was that the dog didn't bark, and from this Holmes has inferred that it's an inside job, that the person who actually stole the horse was one of the people living there, familiar to the dog, and not a stranger. Now, that talent of spotting what hasn't even become a question, it's just an assumption, saying, we're assuming that if people don't buy this product, we don't want them to reply. Why don't we make them reply and say no? We're assuming, for example, that we're simply offering 1 product. Should we be offering 3? We're assuming that when we drop the price, demand will go up. Actually, when you drop the price, one of the biggest inferences people draw from this is that you're desperate or your product's a bit shit. Is there a way of taking that price drop and actually making it feel much, much different by saying, because you have done X, we can let you have Y at full Z? Now, a classical economist would just say, price, good. That's all value consists of. Absolute nonsense. If you can actually personalise the discount and say it's a reward for your loyalty, it's what Jeremy Bournemore calls a bonus, not a bribe, the entire perception of the price change is completely changed. One of them is basically it's a mark of desperation on the part of the seller. change it, reframe it, it's a mark of generosity on the part of the seller. If you say we can only allow 1,000 people to have this discount, again, your perceived value of the discount goes up absolutely enormously. So even something like dropping the price of something, first of all, ask the question, should we be dropping the price at all? Should we be doubling it? Should we be actually creating a new, more expensive product and creating an upgrade path to that, or offering people the option of saving a bit of money by having a slightly downgraded or old-fashioned product? All those questions about path dependency are hugely important. But the vital thing, I think, is all about dogs that don't bark in the night. Your greatest missed insight isn't the insight you have into the problem you're given. It's the insight you have into the problem that no one realised was a problem. And so read Sherlock Holmes short stories, in particular The Sale of the Blaze, and you'll find that the most valuable thing you can do is basically to spot the invisible. No one's attention is focused there. Everybody just basically assumes it out of existence. And all our attention and effort and intelligence is being directed to the things that are really visible. But it's often really, really small things that make all the difference. And the typical thing is, because they're small, they escape our attention altogether.